Hi, welcome to Unplugged with Geraldo and Darren. Thanks for joining us. Like we always do, we're going to discuss the topics that you at home are talking about, as well as provide you with helpful tips and information. Making the headlines is multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein, who awaits trial for sex trafficking. I think most of you would agree that sex trafficking is a form of modern slavery. The statistics are staggering.
Joining us on the show is Dr. Lori Handrahan from the Global Association of Human Trafficking Scholars and the author of Epidemic, America's Trade in Child Rape. We also have media contributor Nick Bryant. Nick is the author of The Franklin Scandal. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is a very weighted topic, as I'm sure you know, so let's get right into it. How common is sex trafficking in the United States? Lori.
America has been for many years one of the largest producers of child pornography around the world. We're producing about half of the world's child pornography. Holland has just eclipsed us as of last year. So if we're producing around half of the world's child pornography, you can imagine how many children are being trafficked to produce that kind of child pornography. Nobody has the exact data. Those are rough numbers.
Is there a reason the United States is so high? Like, do you have any?
It's a great question. I mean, we can only speculate because nobody's really dug in and done the research.
Right.
And until we really get the data and start to try to figure out why this crime is becoming so prolific, we don't have very good answers. I think it's because we have a huge population that has access to broadband internet, and because before Epstein, we've had a lot of impunity for child sex traffickers.
Right.
So America, sadly, has been a great place for white, wealthy men to have impunity to traffic children, as you've seen in the Epstein case.
So Dr. Handrahan, I noticed that some of these cases are kind of similar where you have a person who wants to do good, the Jeffrey Epstein case, you know, but they wanna, it's like cover themselves up, and then all of a sudden you see something totally off the radar. I mean, why is that like a typical course that somebody would take, or?
Yeah, I mean, they don't want to do good. They want to look like they're doing good as their criminal defense mechanism. So the predators are setting up their criminal defense mechanism from a very early age. So if they ever get caught, they can say, oh, I've never been arrested, I have no criminal record.
I'm a
Look at
good
all this
person.
good I've done for the
Right.
community, right? They also, to be a predator, you have to have access to children. So they will create a career looking like they're a humanitarian or a pediatric oncologist or the best secondary school teacher or kindergarten teacher, child protection officer, and they're actually, you know, accessing vulnerable children and trafficking them.
Nick, you know, you're heavily involved in the Franklin Scandal. You're heavily involved in the entire thing. Is there some relation to the Franklin Scandal and Jeffrey Epstein? Are they sort of run by the same heads? Do they relate at all?
There are a number of parallels between the Franklin Scandal and Jeffrey Epstein. Both flew children from coast to coast with impunity for a number of years. Both had sources of wealth that were somewhat ambiguous. Both were covered up by law enforcement. In the case of Lawrence King, you had federal and state law enforcement, and also in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, there was federal and state law enforcement. And also, there was tremendous amount of harassment to the victims. When both the scandals started to become unglued, the victims were just received tremendous amounts of heat.
So let's talk about
So many
discrediting the victims in this case, which seems to be a popular target or a popular tool used. Why is that so, I guess, why is it so orchestrated? Why is it so manipulated?
The victims are easy to compromise. I mean, you take kids that are generally from lower socioeconomic backgrounds,
Right.
and then they're repeatedly molested, and a lot of times they're either turned on to drugs or they start taking drugs to assuage their pain. And then at a certain point, they get expunged, they lose their youthful marketability, and they get expunged by that network. And basically what you have is someone that's going to be from a background that generally wasn't the paragon of sanity. And then they were repeatedly molested, and a lot of times they're drug addicts, and they've done things that have compromised their own integrity. So victims are quite easy to dismiss and shred their integrity. And that's one of the problems, is that when kids come forward, they're often dismissed, especially when they're saying, I was molested by this powerful individual, or I was molested by this senator, or I was molested by this representative. It's a kid that is generally has a lot of issues, and some of them have even been in prison. So it's a perfect system because the victims compromise their own integrity.
Right. It's almost like a closed loop.
Yes.
That's right.
You sort of described like a perfect victim, just for lack of a better term, but I'm curious, Dr. Lori, is there sort of a common like predator profile that people should look out for? You know, Nick, please feel free to jump in, but curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So from my book, Epidemic, I looked at lots of different professions to see if there was a profile. And now we're digging into child sex trafficking in higher education, which is something that nobody's talking about. I have a group of research assistants, and we're going to have a database up by the end of the summer, where we're looking at professors and university employees who've been arrested on child pornography, child sex trafficking charges. I'd say, I mean, I have over 200 already. So the predator profile is they tend to be highly awarded, so they seek out awards to look like. So they're always the Boys and Girls Club volunteer who gave the most hours. They get awards for ethics in the communities. They work at the soup kitchens.
The do-gooders.
The do-gooders.
Exactly.
Humanitarian careers, they go into humanitarian careers. So they're both highly awarded, and then they have access to vulnerable children. And if the children aren't inherently vulnerable, they will make the children vulnerable, as Nick was explaining, by drugging them while they rape them, by destroying their family networks, by isolating them, by saying no one's going to believe you. And predators are highly networked by definition. The crime is a networked crime.
Right.
So as Nick was saying, I mean, our criminal justice system is very broken. And the reason that victims haven't been believed is because you have defense attorneys, you have assistant attorney generals, you have heads of police and law enforcement who are also involved in the crime. Mm-hmm. So a predator will typically say to a child, I know the DA, no one's ever going to believe you, right?
Right.
So the predators don't want to go to jail, right? They
Right.
want to enjoy impunity. So they specifically schedule their crime in a strategic way to make sure that they have impunity.
Wow.
So even credible, so-called credible victims are chewed up by this broken criminal justice system where there are a lot of predators around.
Right. So, Nick, Lawrence King and Jeffrey Epstein, how were they able to traffic these kids from state to state?
Well, there was obviously law enforcement protection.
Right.
With Jeffrey,
There has to be.
There has to be.
With Lawrence King, what's kind of interesting is with Lawrence King, social services went to state police and went to federal police, law enforcement, and said that Lawrence King is running a trafficking network, and they were simply ignored. And ultimately, what happened in that case is some senators, Nebraska state senators, heard about it, and they formed a Franklin committee, and then they started digging into it, and then ultimately there was much more malfeasance by state and federal law enforcement to cover it up because these senators hired a very good investigator. With Jeffrey Epstein, you saw a lot of state malfeasance in the grand jury. I mean, the grand jury enabled him. The Palm Beach Police Department had 5 victims, underage victims that had come forward who they talked to, and then they had a number of corroborating people. And in that state grand jury, Jeffrey Epstein was indicted on 1 count of adult pandering. So he wasn't indicted on any counts of child trafficking or child pandering. And one of the things is grand juries are they've been notorious. They're very easy to sway because a special prosecutor is appointed to be the prosecutor of a grand jury. And grand jurors are just regular citizens that have come in for jury duty.
Right.
And so they're sitting there, and then the special prosecutor puts the evidence in front of them.
Right.
And then they ultimately decide whether or not they're going to indict. So only evidence that the special prosecutor deems worthy are shown to these grand jurors. So it's a very easy way to cover up.
Well, the Epstein and the King case sort of have a lot of similarities, and both seem to get a little cozy with presidential candidates, president himself. Why do you think that is?
Right.
Well, in both the Epstein and the Franklin scandal, the predators, as I've said, have gone up to Mount Olympus. I mean, they were pandering children to the highest echelons of government. And I think that that's one of the reasons why they were doing that with impunity, is because these guys could pull strings to make sure that Lawrence King and Jeffrey Epstein were unscathed, and both of them were largely unscathed for many years.
But it almost seems like they're hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you're going to take a picture with the president, that's the most visible you could
Exactly,
possibly
right,
be.
yeah.
Like, they're not in these underground networks.
Right,
They're out.
right.
Like, is it a cockiness about them? I'm just, like, flabbergasted.
No,
by the whole thing.
what Lori was talking about, they create this public veneer.
Right.
And that's part of their public veneer.
Right.
And then someone says, well, that guy couldn't possibly have molested a kid. You know,
Right,
he
donates
he
to
donates, and
Right,
there's a
right.
picture of him with the president. So that's the situation, is that they know how to insulate themselves, and they know how to create a veneer that makes them look like fine, upstanding citizens.
Wow. So what can families learn from all of this? How can we as society, what can we do as a society to help alleviate the issue? I mean, what can people do? I mean, there's got to be some answers.
Or some red flags that people
right?
can at least...
Something that we can, right, look forward.
Well, I think that what we have to do as a society is, right now, we're troubled by statute of limitations. And New York just completely abolished the statute of limitations on child sexual abuse. And that's what we have to do now. State and the federal government, state governments and federal governments need to abolish the statute of limitations, because that will hold various institutions to be much more accountable. If they know that they can be sued for the duration, they're going to be much more cautious about
Right.
whether or not predators are going to be part of their organization.
They're not waiting for that timeline to just like run
Yes.
out. Dr. Lori, I'm wondering about some signs of predatory behavior that maybe the public out there can at least, you know, absorb and learn from. Is there anything that you can shed light to?
Yeah, so these are great questions. I think doing shows like you're doing, having us on to talk about this issue is incredibly important, because it's been a subject that the media hasn't been interested in covering prior to Epstein and Larry Nassar, prior to the Me Too movement.
Right.
I would go to many journalists and say, could you please cover this? I know Nick can speak to this as well. And people be like, my editor said it's too disgusting of a topic. You know, people don't want to hear about it. We don't want to talk about it. So there's been this taboo in America of not talking about it. And what I always say is predators count on your silence, right?
Right.
Pedophiles count on you being silent. So the first thing that everybody can do is stand up and speak out. If you've been victimized, don't hide it. Speak out. Go to the media. Get on your local talk shows. Write an op-ed.
The best
go to your
disinfectant is
community.
sunlight.
Absolutely. And in my book, I have all these little action items, because people will always say, what can I do?
Right.
So there's a lot of easy things that you can do now with social media too, right?
Totally.
Go to your courthouse. Get the criminal complaint by the volleyball coach that was arrested at your
Right.
university. Put that criminal complaint around town so people knew what he did, so he can't be rehired in another school and victimize more children, right? Get the word out. Everybody has a voice, and everybody can use that voice. And then in terms of policy, I mean, Nick's absolutely right. Statute of limitations has to be eradicated across the entire country, nationally, every state. Also, prosecutorial discretion has to be eliminated. There's no oversight for prosecutors, and prosecutors can do whatever they want. You know this from
Yes.
this term. Prosecutorial discretion is the dirtiest two words in America, in my opinion. So until we have oversight of how prosecutors treat victims, when victims come forward and say, I was raped by this powerful man, we won't be able to change the system, because to me that's the biggest roadblock. So many prosecutors dismiss the victims, marginalize them, or prey on them themselves.
And groom them to sort
Groom
of
them.
become the perfect victims.
Absolutely.
And little Stockholm syndrome almost.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's. I'm so happy you guys are coming on to talk about
Thank you
this.
so much for being here, and hopefully, you know, we can shed a light onto
Yeah.
this issue.
Thank you for doing the show.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, stay with us. We'll be right back.